The Rebel Capitalist Show.
I believe we're going to have a complete bifurcation in the world into other blocks of
Right.
of interest, right?
Like the West versus the BRIC countries or something.
Yeah, that's sort of the obvious one. And remember, within the certainly within the West, there are different policies and different opinions. It's not like they're all, collectively down the same path. Although I think there is more, probably a higher level of, sort of, shall we say, connectivity within sort of Europe, North America, which is Canada, and America, tied into the Davos crowd, and they have a pretty firm grip. The United States a little bit less, purely as a consequence of the fact that you have a republic, which is just it's different to Canada, it's different to the UK, it's different to many of the European countries. Outside of that, you've got the BRICS. We could say it's sort of Russia, China, India, and then you have what is largely called the global South. And I think what's going to happen, and we're seeing this now playing out, I wrote about it in a weekly, the global South is going to become the political football within this power play, because there's actually, from a financial side, George, what we've got is two very, very different systems. If we go back sort of 40 odd years ago and we go, what's transpired over our lifetime? I'm 45. You're roughly the same age. So over our professional lifetimes, what's really been the major thing that we've witnessed take place? It's been a de-industrialization of the Western world. We've outsourced all of our manufacturing, all the resource extraction, all of those things have been outsourced largely to we could call it the East. And then as a derivative of the East, it's been the global South, which is Africa, Latin America, South America.
Okay.
And the way that's been held together by the hegemonic power, predominantly in the United States, has been, as John Perkins mentioned in his book, and readers or listeners might be fully aware of the economic hitman. And if you haven't read it, I strongly suggest it. And John talks about how these sort of quote unquote non-governmental organizations have influenced federal powers, basically to indebt them, turn them into serfs, and extract the resources and the wealth for the benefit of the hegemon. Now, that structure has been changing over the last 10 odd years, to the effect where China's basically been doing the same thing with massive Chinese loans. And I've shown this before in writings. So Chinese loans into Africa now way exceed those of Western powers, right, for building railroads and infrastructure and everything else. So there's an economic play that's been taking place, or under our eyes, and no one's really paid too much attention to it. But I believe we're now moving into a time where those cards get played. So if you think about the two economic systems, we've had this deindustrialization of the West, which has largely been supplanted with a financialized economy. Everything's become financialized. That at the same time, we have in the BRICS this industrializing, I kind of call it industrial capitalism, with socialistic tendencies. Now we're seeing these two economic systems clashing with one another.
So how does that bifurcation impact supply of commodities? Because I think, just as someone who really hasn't given this much thought, they say, okay, Chris, well, fine. You got Mexico picking Russia, or Colombia picking the United States, and they have to make these decisions. But there's still the same amount of supply of stuff, most likely, it's being created for global markets. So what's the big deal?
Well, there's not the same amount of stuff being created. So what we're seeing is there's a lot of demand destruction. But with demand destruction, we've also got productivity destruction. So those emerging markets are in a very, very precarious situation. and some of them were going to have a balance of payments crisis, and they will default. Now, the question then is, how do they come out of that? Well, probably there'll be IMF loans coming at them, right, to get them to go down a certain path. But again, we come back to what we just discussed. It's not, things don't happen in a vacuum, right? There are other players that are looking at the incentives there. So if you just took a typical, take an Eastern African country, which has got huge loans now with Chinese banks in terms of their infrastructure, that has a balance of payments crisis, can't afford the food, et cetera, and the IMF come along and go, hey, we're here to help. Part of the problem is that the Chinese banks are also there to help. And they want more control, not less control. And they want and need those resources that are now in short supply. So I think there's a decent probability that goods and services start being traded literally for their underlying value. And maybe it's a basket of currencies, maybe it's even an SDR, right? But it's something other than the dollar. And that in itself means that your facilitation of trade is much more difficult, right? Which means that you will have less supply. If you think about the wheels of commerce, or the grease that keeps it going, that grease has all been taken away. There's cogs in there. It just gets churned up. Our supply chains are broken. Those are the physical supply chains. What we're talking about really sort of are the monetary supply chains. And the grease is being taken out of them. That always impacts productivity and production. I mean, a really good example was in Nigeria. There was a food manufacturing facility that makes sunflower oil, amongst other things. Okay, we're in a food crisis. These guys had to shut down. Why? Because they couldn't source dollars. They couldn't source dollars to pay dollar debts. And it wasn't because they were unprofitable at the time, right? But it was an inability to source dollars at the price that they needed to. And so these guys, they shut down their factory. So this is, as the financial architecture that's been built over the last 40 years is being used now as a weapon. It's causing this massive contraction that will be solved by the market. That's why I say this is a time where you can have other currency systems come into force purely because they have to, just to try and survive. And in a normal environment, you would look at it and go, no, that's not going to happen. It's too hard. Well, it's now a do or die situation. But in that time frame, what happens is you have a massive constriction of productivity and supply of all sorts of goods and services. Just as the West is using the dollar as a financial weapon and credit as a financial weapon, what we're likely to see, what you do is you look in your own toolbox and you go, you bastards, what have I got to fight with?
Exactly. Right.
And so the tools that each country have in their toolbox are then presented. Whether they use them or not, we don't know.
It's like how the Vietnamese fought us in the war.
It's right. Very, very good example. Yeah. And then the next iteration beyond that, right? Because the first thing that we do in a time of crisis is we hunker down, right? So we go tribal. We go to our own. We know what we like. If you're a country that has wheat, you're like, okay, well, at least we got wheat, right? We're going to grow our own wheat, but we might need diesel, right? So that's the next step. You're like, okay, well, we got the wheat. We don't want to deal, like, screw everyone else, hunker down. And then you're like, oh shit, I need diesel. I need to go out now. And so in the same regional context, what happens is countries will hunker down. That's protectionism. That will increase the cost. It will reduce the flow of goods, right? Which itself often can, especially when they're critical elements in terms of what we as humans need to survive, that can bring war, because the only way that you can get it is to go out and get it. And if you have it and your neighbor doesn't, they're going to come to get it if they need to survive. So you either have conflict in order to settle that difference, or you have an alliance built.
Yeah.
And what we're watching now with the BRICS in particular are these alliances being built where they're going, okay, I need energy, I need this, I need that. And they're forming alliances which you wouldn't necessarily have seen formed before. It's not necessarily that they have the same ideological approach to something. Some countries have got dictatorships, other ones have quasi-democracies. Some are, you take most of South America, it's Christian Catholic oriented. You take the Muslim world in the Middle East, it's not, but there is an alliance being formed, rapidly now. I would suspect within the next 18 months, Saudi Arabia is going to join BRICS. It'll stun most people, but that's likely to happen because their military alliances have already been formed with Russia. Okay, so all these that's a good thing. Alliances mean less chance of war, right? Because it's like that old saying, when goods and services don't move across borders, bullets do. Well, we need those goods and services to move across borders so that we don't have bullets moving across borders.
Yeah, but also they're kind of unplugging from the Eurodollar system, which is to say they're unplugging from a system which gives incredibly efficient access to capital and liquidity in the form of those dollars. So if they're unplugging from that, it'd be basically like the United States unplugging from using currency, going back to a barter system. You can think about what we're talking about to economic activity there. It would really slow down until they come up with some other solution. But even if it is the yuan or ruble or whatever you want to plug in, it's not going to have the infrastructure isn't going to be as efficient as allocating liquidity as the Eurodollar system.
That grease, if you will, I like to think of it as grease on an oil or a turbine or something.
Right.
You're taking that away, and so it's a very difficult decision to make. So I think that some countries won't make it, and they'll choose to go down the IMF World Bank path, which ultimately will destroy and or cause civil unrest within the country. And then others will watch that and go, oh, okay, so that's the result, right? So it's at this point in time, I think the global South is kind of like this football that gets knocked around. You choose the grease that you knew, which is now no longer as greasy as it used to be. It's still, and it's increasingly problematic. It's the quicksand you're diving into. Or you choose to go down another path, and that other path is going to be way, way less greasy. If it's not going to be as fluid. It's going to be much. It's still being built. In fact, you're part of building it. And so I think what that means from us as from an investment perspective is to expect stagflation.
Yeah.
There are positives to this because what we will see built is a new system, or maybe multiple new systems. If we go back in history, what often can happen is you have multiple new systems, and then it coalesces over the course of decades into one that basically proves to be the best, or most productive, or whatever the case might be for whatever reason. Okay, and so we're in that transition phase. That's always chaotic, but it needs to happen. It's going to happen anyway, so you might as well just buckle up and get on with it. But the other thing that is useful in this is that all of these coercive tactics and everything else that are being utilized increasingly become less effective, and the ability to hold them together by the coercive elites, if you will, becomes weakened. And there's an asymmetry here too, because there's two options available to them. When the narrative collapses, you either have to step back and go, okay, we've lost that particular narrative battle, and I'm going to get torched in my own building. So maybe I'm going to, step back and
lose the battle, win the war.
Sort of pull back from this, or you go full retard, complete police state, and I think we're going to see both.
Right.
So if you look at Europe, which has always been the warring tribal bloody countries, that's what I think we're likely to see. Some countries are just going to go completely full retard, lockdown. They will be unrecognizable. They already are unrecognizable from a few years prior, but over the decade, they will become really unrecognizable. And then others will see that writing on the wall and see the risks in it and go, I don't want to be torched. And we're going to have to choose. And so it's difficult, of course, at this point in time to know who's going to do what, where, and how, other than to know that it'll be a chaotic period of time where we will have this stagflationary environment. So when we come to allocating our capital and resources, we need to be very cognizant of watching all of these things. While, I mean, like I like to say that it seems obvious as to where we need to be invested in terms of sectors.
Right.
But the geographies is probably one of the most difficult things for us to be able to ascertain.